Thank you so much for inviting me here into this beautiful country. It is such a treat to be here and to talk to you about a topic that I feel very passionate about how to make better decisions in a world that is not always perfect. To start out, I would like to take you back with me for a moment to the Wild West, so to speak, to start us out with a true story that has been very influential to the art and science of decision making. This is Arizona, the Phoenix River Delta. It's a very dry country, very much a desert climate really, but as so often with deserts, when there is rain, there can be a lot of it at once, and the ground does not have the kind of vegetation that would absorb these masses of water quickly enough. So what happens sometimes are these flash floods that can be quite destructive and devastating, and of course costly to a community when it comes to rescue missions and later cleanup and repair. So to protect that area from flooding and get more control over the water, back in the 70s, Congress approved the Central Arizona Project, a plan that called for the construction of a dam at the confluence of the Salt and Verde rivers. A problem the plan didn't particularly mention was that the dam's reservoir would have flooded more than half of an Indian reservation, the Yavapai Reservation, including most of their tribal farm. The Yavapai fought the project for 10 years, and they were not the only ones fighting. There were environmental groups who were concerned about the habitat of bald eagles in that area that would have been threatened, and then there were also recreational concerns about the wonderful hiking trail system that would have disappeared in the reservoir of the dam. So finally, a study team was hired under Curtis Brown, who's a behavioral psychologist, and he involved the committee with outside experts as well as members from all of the opposing interest groups. And under his facilitation, they developed a full set of criteria, which included not only the original goals of the project, but all of the additional concerns. Then they called for new project proposals and evaluated all those options, new and old, along all of the criteria. What you see here is a simplified version that displays only 3 of the many more options that were considered. You can see the criteria on the x-axis and the ratings on the y-axis, showing how well each project proposal fulfilled each of the criteria. The Orm Dam, the original plan, is shown in red, and you can see here how 2 of the new options both scored higher, not just on the new criteria but on all criteria. So this new Waddell system here, which came out as a winner, was adopted as the new plan suddenly, actually without any controversy at all. And in fact, if you Google Orm Dam now, you don't find anything about the actual dam plans. What you do find is that the Yavapai still celebrate their victory over the dam to this day every year. And I see this also as a celebration of a good decision process. Because what does this story show us? It is a really nice illustration of something that has been shown already before then and afterwards in many studies. It shows how this kind of structured decision process, and I'll say more about how this process looks like in a more generalized form, can lead to 2 things. It can lead to an astonishing amount of innovation. There were several new project proposals that were all around winners compared to the Orm Dam, which means better on every criterion. But it can also lead to an astonishing amount of agreement, even for controversial topics. And I think that a part of that agreement may come from the fact that decision outcomes are objectively better with more innovation like that, but perhaps just as importantly, a process that is able to include diverse criteria from all parties is perceived as fair, and people are actually willing to make personal sacrifices if they see that there's fairness and that there is a serious effort being made to include everyone's interests. So with this story still in mind as an example, I would like to guide you through a more general framework of a decision process so that you can apply that process to any decision. I'd like to talk about 3 stages which ideally come in this order. We would like to start by defining what the criteria are, before then moving on to search for options and then evaluate those options based on the criteria. It's a very straightforward process seen like this, but I'd like to show you some best practices for each of those steps. First, as the example made very clear, it is crucial to fully understand what the criteria should be and to make sure that your set of criteria covers the interests of everyone. And for that you need to understand, first of all, who the main stakeholders are. In other words, who in your community will be most affected by the decision and what are their concerns. So if you want to make a decision that's supported by a community, you need to know what everyone's goals are, what their hopes and wishes are, but also their concerns, their fears and objections. A very practical method to collect all this is to bring people together in a room, give them stacks of sticky notes and ask them to write down all their concerns, their hopes, fears, etc., and then sort those issues into broader topics to determine independent factors. Because what you want as a result from this process is a small set of factors that should be independent and not overlapping, so that you can evaluate your options for each of those criteria separately. That's not as easy a task as I make it sound here, but for public policy decisions you might typically be able to group issues into economic, social and environmental factors. So thinking about these categories might help as a starting point to sort out issues. And then, once you have a good set of criteria, run this by all parties and get everyone's approval. This is a really important moment in the decision process. If you can get people to pre-commit to this set of criteria, you're off to a really good start. And this is the moment to start discussing your options. You can always assume that there are better options out there than the ones you've already considered. The problem is that it's impossible for us to see that in advance, but there are a lot of studies showing that our first ideas for solutions are usually not the best, and that it pays off to keep thinking even after you think you've found a good solution to a problem. If you're working with people who have different interests, make use of that diversity of opinions to get those people to work by calling for proposals and getting bids. And depending on a decision, you may need to involve experts to come up with project proposals, but in other cases the stakeholders themselves might come up with them. Either way, you'll want to make sure everyone understands the full set of criteria so that they can propose solutions that fulfill those best. So make sure people understand how their proposals will be evaluated along those criteria. And this is what we'll look at next. There are different tools that we can use to evaluate options. I'll only talk about one of them here, the decision table, because it's the one I use most often, especially for group decisions, because it is so straightforward and easy to understand that people usually accept it as a fair and transparent tool. This here is the basic structure. You have all your criteria as column headers and all your options as row headers. Once you have a decision in this sort of a matrix structure, you can do all kinds of things. You can use the table to collect information, and you can give it to experts to help you fill in each cell with estimates. And then of course you can evaluate your options based on your criteria. I'm going to show you an example of how this table structure was used in a public decision in Oregon. This is part of the coastline of Oregon. More specifically, you can see here two towns, Tillamook in the east and Oceanside in the west. And the decision the county faced here was that they had to choose a route for a new power line. In the US, these power lines are still largely overground with traditional poles and wires, and so wherever you decide to place them, people will be affected by this. There will be properties, farmland, but also forests and public lands on the way, so it will have visual impacts, environmental impacts, but also social impacts, depending on who ends up with a bunch of poles and wires in their backyard, right? So people in this community will want to have a say in this decision. At the same time though, it is a very complex decision, and you'll want people to make an informed choice, not just cast a vote for one route or another without knowing the facts. And so my colleague Simon Parati, who was facilitating this process, created an actual voting ballot in the form of a decision table. This is what it looked like. I'll walk you through this and we'll zoom in on some things, so you don't need to be able to read the small font here, but I do want you to see what this looked like as a whole, because this is what we distributed as a large color printout at a public meeting, and it contains all the facts and at the same time serves as a voting ballot. So here you can see the alternatives, the suggested routes of the new power lines, all listed here as rows. And here on top you can see the criteria along with specifications as to how those criteria were measured. For example, one way to measure social or property impacts was the number of private properties that would be affected by the new route. Or a way to measure environmental impacts was the number of streams that would have to be crossed by the power line. Then the voters could actually in this case determine how important they considered each of those criteria to be. Here you can see it up close, zoomed in on the social criteria of property effects and visual impacts and reliability. That is how often people would have to expect power outages due to storms, etc., and how easy those would be to fix. So on their paper ballot, the voters could circle one number to say how important they thought this criterion was compared to the others. Then down here, there were facts and estimates listed for each of the routes, covering all aspects of these criteria. And here in color is where the voting happens. Again, I'll zoom in on one of those. I'm zooming in on the bottom corner here, again on social factors, here property and visual impacts. So under the assumption that less impact is better, voters were here able to review all the facts and estimates as to, for example, how many landowners and properties would be affected in what ways by each route, and then hopefully somewhat in line with these facts, but that was really up to the voters' judgment. They were asked to circle one of those dots. The green dot if they thought the proposed route met the criteria well, the red dot if the criteria were not met or poorly met, and the yellow dot if it was somewhere here in the middle. And these colors corresponded to numbers on a scale here from 1 worst to 5 best, and were used as such in the calculations, which we'll get to next. You can probably see where this is going. We're going to use these 1 to 5 ratings together with the importance ratings from earlier to calculate the total scores for each route. And this is what the results look like. So here you can see all the proposed routes again as row headers, and each of the criteria as column headers. And right underneath the column headers you can see the importance weights for each criterion. These come simply from the averages of the voters' scores and were then translated into percentages. And in the body of the table, in the cells, you can see the average of the 1 to 5 ratings. And you can see the total scores as the sum of the weighted ratings, just multiplying the importance ratings with each of the row ratings and then summing up that row. The nice thing about this process is that even someone who would have personally preferred, say, route E1 here, can easily see why route E3 got higher scores, and they'll be more likely to accept this process as fair and transparent, even if they don't personally like the results. Okay, so just to finish, let me sum up what I consider an ideal approach here. And as you've seen in the examples, you may sometimes encounter realities that don't allow that ideal order, because you may be called into the process too late, but it's still good to know what ideal you want to approach. You want to start out by defining the criteria, and in a community decision, you'll want to involve all parties, all stakeholders in this process to develop a complete set of measurable criteria. Then you search for options, more and better options than you thought were possible, ideally again by involving the stakeholders in developing proposals of solutions. And then you can evaluate your options along those criteria by way of voting. So rather than asking for a yes or no vote, use decision tables as voting ballots. And then I hope that your stakeholders too, just like the Yavapai, will be able to celebrate these decisions for decades to come.